100 Facts About George Washington. Chapter 1. Youth Origin. Fact number 1. 2 birthdays calendar change. Due to the 1752 adoption of the Gregorian calendar by Great Britain and its colonies, George Washington is one of the few people whose birth date technically falls into 2 different years. His original birth date was February 11, 1731, Julian calendar, which was adjusted to February 22, 1732, Gregorian calendar. Fact number 2. Born a natural redhead. Q35. George Washington was born a natural redhead, a ginger from birth. Fact number 3. First career. Surveyor. George Washington's first career was as a surveyor. Fact number 4. Practiced rules of civility and character. As a young man, Washington transcribed and practiced a list of 110 rules of conduct called Rules of Civility and Decent Behavior in Company and Conversation, which guided his behavior throughout his life. Fact number 5. He had only a formal education up to about age 15 and was largely self-taught afterward, focusing on surveying, military tactics, and classical literature.
First experienced tooth loss, ages 22 to 24.
The cherry tree myth. Weems' book, The Life of Washington, was released after his death. The phrase, "I cannot tell a lie," was added 6 years later.
You should already know these facts, but I'm going to do a quick rundown. The whole AI thing wasn't working for me. So here's 100 facts about George Washington. Fact number 1, George Washington was technically born on 2 years and 2 different days, because we changed from the Julian calendar. Of course, originally he was born February 22nd, 1732, but on the Julian calendar, it was actually like February 11th, 1731. So that's something. Here's another fact. George Washington was originally a redhead. So yeah, he was the redheaded stepchild of the Revolution. Fact number 3. This was George Washington's original job. He would survey the land. Fact number 4. George Washington had like 110 rules that he governed himself by. That was pretty cool. Here's another fact. At age 18, George Washington stopped his formal education. Here's another fact. Between the ages of 22 and 24, George Washington started to lose his teeth. And when you hear about teeth, you think of wood, as in George Washington had wooden teeth. Another false fact, but it's fact number 7. Speaking of wooden teeth and false fact and wood, when it comes to the whole cherry tree myth, where George Washington said, alas, he could not cut down the cherry tree and be a liar. That turns out that was a myth. Most likely, George Washington did not cut down that cherry tree. And this ties into another fact. When it comes to Pastor Weems, George Washington could never tell a lie, but he surely can. Historians definitely think that Pastor Weems decided to make a Weems scheme about passing down false stories about George Washington. His first book, The Life of Washington, was released 1 to 3 months after George Washington's death. So, of course, he could not call Pastor Weems a liar or say that this is a myth. And the phrase, "I cannot tell a lie," was added 6 years later in a separate book. It was like volume 5 of his books about George Washington. And yes, his biographies were so long, probably due to the fact that most of it was fabricated, that he had like 6 series books come out about his life. And here's another fact. George Washington is one of 5 presidents to marry a widow. Martha Washington was widowed with 2 kids, none of whom were George Washington's biological kids. And here's a fact when it comes to the Georges. George Washington was married on January 6, 1759, the same day that another President George H.W. Bush, got wedded. George H.W. Bush got wedded on January 6, 1945. And here's a bonus fact. Did you know that George Washington Bible was sweared on when it came to George H.W. Bush's swearing as president? That's very interesting. Number 13, George Washington never had any biological children. I alluded to this earlier, but no biological kids. He, however, had Jackie and Pasty from Martha Washington, who previously had another husband that sadly died. But yeah, let's keep on moving on. Fact number 15, George Washington inherited his estate from Lawrence Washington, who died in 1752. Talk about big bro, big dough. Fact number 15, George Washington's favorite food was hoe cakes. Hoe cakes was definitely his favorite food. For everybody who doesn't know what hoe cakes are, it was like this historic, like pancake that was associated with the poor and enslaved. And no wonder George Washington definitely had a lot of slaves, but that has to do with later on when it comes to fact. Here's another fact. George Washington's favorite drink was Madeira wine. And when I mean drink, I just mean liquid, not like favorite liquor, but probably his favorite drink. It probably counts for both. And how do I know all these facts? It's because George Washington kept a personal diary with over 2,300 diary entries between 1748 through his death 1799. It spread to 3,800 pages. That's about like 3 times the size of the Bible. But hey, this guy, James Thomas, famously stated that George Washington slept with prostitutes, although historians are skeptical of this because, he never met George Washington, and George Washington never put it in any of his numerous entries. It is worth noting, though. And it's not like George Washington didn't write about stuff that could be embarrassing, like the fact that he only had one tooth when he became president. He only had one natural tooth left. That's because, remember when I said back in the age 22, he started losing his teeth? He had very bad hygiene. So, of course, by the time he got to his 50s, he lost all his teeth. Speaking of teeth, his teeth wasn't made out of wood and stuff like that. It was actually made out of gold, lead, and parts from elephants and human teeth as well. Where did he get them human teeth? From slaves. He got it from slaves. He bought teeth from dentists who usually would collect slaves' teeth, and then he put it in his mouth. So you could theoretically say that the first president had a mouth like a black man, And speaking of mouth, do any of you like whiskey? Because George Washington did. He had one of the largest distilleries, and although it didn't have a name particularly, his rye whiskey is still being sold today, seen up here. But George Washington had other interests other than whiskey, like the fact that he had over 30 foxhounds throughout his life. But tying it all together is George Washington really loved naming his foxhounds after alcohol, particularly what it does to you. Like he had a foxhound named Tipsy, and also Tipsy was one of the main dogs of which the breed that George Washington bred, which is the American Foxhound. He is called the father of the American Foxhound because he basically bred that that breed into distinction. So yes, and also his favorite sport was none other than fox hunting. No wonder he bred so many foxhounds. And typically, as a big, strong man, he had size 13 shoe. And with that size 13 shoe, he was called the Devourer of Villages by the natives. And you know what also devours? Smallpox. At the age 19, George Washington had smallpox, but later he defeated it and became basically immune throughout his whole life. And why did George Washington have smallpox? He didn't get it from the natives, or at least American natives, but he got it from Barbados. And also, what he did get from the natives was them surrendering along with him, as he had to surrender Fort Necessary. This is back then when they didn't really name forts after people, just I guess phrases. Fort Necessary. And why did he have to give it up? Because George Washington historically lost more battles than he won. But the ones that he surely did win must have counted so much so for him. And here's a battle that George Washington lost. The Battle of the Sexes, as George Washington was fooled into sending Benedict Arnold's wife to him once she, Peggy, lied to George Washington. He was a sucker. But here's something that George Washington didn't lose. In one British poll, he was rated as the greatest enemy general. He surpassed Napoleon, probably because, British people hate Napoleon and hate the French more than Americans. But that's a side note. But here's something that the British also hate: giving up power, which was shocking to why when George Washington resigned being commander-in-chief in 1783 after the job was done. He went back to his home, and this was a shocker because usually people would take hold of power. But he probably went home because he missed William Lee, his personal chauffeur. He was his most entrusted enslaved person. He was so trusted that of the 123 slaves that George Washington had personally owned, he was the only one who he personally freed after he died. The other slaves would have been freed after Martha died, of course. Speaking of death, George Washington in 1976 was rated general of all the armies of the United States, so no general would surpass him. Speaking of surpassing him, George Washington was never surpassed when it came to dueling because he never dueled. He never dueled and even told his officers that if they did, they would be seriously court-martialed or fined. But maybe one of the reasons why George Washington never dueled was he never had competition, quite like he never had competition when it came to the various elections that started in 1789 when he became the only U.S. president to be unanimously elected. He was elected twice, and he was elected without a party, and he was given an annual salary of $25,000. He was called the president, and he served in two separate cities. He served in Philadelphia and New York, two northern cities, southern president in a northern city, of which he never used "so help me God." It was only until 1854 that it was suggested that he used this phrase. It was actually first used by Chester A. Arthur in his swearing. So it took 30 years after this suggested "so help me God" phrase to even catch on. George Washington didn't even use the term God, Jesus Christ. He rather used the term Almighty Being because back then deism was pretty popular. But what wasn't popular was presidential cabinets. That's why George Washington had to create one. He created the Secretary of State, Treasury, War, and now the Department of Defense is now the Department of War again. And the attorneys general, of course. And he also passed the Bill of Rights. During his presidency, the Bill of Rights was passed. And that wasn't the only department that he made. He also appointed 6 Supreme Court justices. So yes, he pretty much created the Supreme Court, and he appointed 6 justices. At that time, 6 was the maximum limit, and it wasn't until 1869 that it was made into 9. And during the Whiskey Rebellion, George Washington became the only president to personally lead an army. And I mean personally, as in that there was this guy named James Madison that did something similar, but George Washington personally led troops in the field of combat, even though when they arrived, everybody scattered. Probably because George Washington led 13,000 men. That was a larger force than what he led in the Battle of Long Island or the Battle of Germantown. Speaking of town, George Washington personally chose the location of Washington, D.C., named after him. Although, sadly, he never got a chance to live in the White House, as it was created a year after he died. George Washington actually lived in what can be described as a red brick house, as he lived in 2 temporary capitals, but never the finished one. It is a fact that George Washington is the only person in history to have a U.S. state, Washington, named after him, and the U.S. national capital city of Washington, D.C., named after him. And here's something that's finally not named after George Washington: Morocco, as George Washington has one of the longest unbroken treaties. It was Morocco, one of the first countries to recognize America. And since we're recognizing things, let's recognize George Washington's 670 slaves during his lifetime and 317 during his death. Before the days of his death, he had 317 slaves, if you count the slaves that, his wife also had, which will be counted in his household. And he was very conniving with these slaves, moving them in and out of Pennsylvania every 6 months so they don't get their freedom. That's why 17 to 19 of them escaped to the British line during the American Civil War. A notable 2 of them were Washington and Deborah, who escaped to Canada. Another one was Onyx Judge, who escaped a year before Chef Hercules. Now, Chef Hercules is a person that we will discuss later on, but Anna had a $10 bounty on her, which doesn't seem much, but by today's standards, it's about $200-300. So yeah, he missed her. And don't judge her for wanting to return back, but she said to George Washington that she would return back only if upon his death that he would free her and her offspring, which George Washington was not feeling it. And here's a person who also escaped. Chef Hercules. Chef Hercules is a person who escaped and did not adopt George Washington's name after escaping. So that shows a lot. And Chef Hercules was called America's first celebrity chef, as George Washington would allow him to sell scraps. And I guess that's how he scrapped up enough money to escape. But maybe George Washington wasn't too cruel because he was the only one of the founding fathers to enact to free large scale his slaves. None of them did that. None of them really did that. And speaking of slaves, let's go back to old Billy Williams Lee, who was you know, the only person, again, the only person who was given freedom, and he was given freedom with around $30 or 700 to $1,000 annually. So yes, and all the slaves are supposed to be free upon Martha's death, which really made her concerned. So she freed them because she didn't want them to have a reason to kill her. Speaking of kill, George Washington would kill for a son, and thus the urban legend or the oral history of Westford is born, where it claims that Westford was the love child of George Washington through his mother Venus. But historians are skeptical. And speaking of being skeptical, George Washington did not want to run for a second term, but alas, a friend of his encouraged him. Elizabeth, we call her Liz, encouraged him to run for a second term, as she was afraid that the country would fall apart without him. And speaking of fall apart, Paul Revere wasn't revered by Washington that much, as he wrote to Washington in 1791 about, getting a job, and Washington did not return back. But who definitely revered George Washington is Lafayette Lafayette, who, of course, named his son George Washington Lafayette, which, was pretty cool. And Mr. Lafayette was imprisoned and even wrote to George Washington during the French Revolution. And y'all like the American South? Well, the American Revolution did, and that's why they elected George Washington as not only the first president, but the first president from Dixie, and he was one of 8 presidents from Lady Virginia. So yeah, and he was born in the Church of England. He was baptized as a infant, so and he was baptized in Virginia. Even though he was baptized into the church, he only came to church once a month. This had to do with the fact that, back then there were a shortage of clergy. So there was a pastor that would go through different churches and only preach once a month. So he would have 4 churches. He would preach once a month and it was maybe only going to church once a month is why George Washington had to take prayer in his own hand and pray in the valley. Or did he? Most likely he did not, because Isaac Potts' story was most likely fabricated. But what wasn't fabricated is George Washington putting out the first Thanksgiving proclamation. George Washington put out the first Thanksgiving proclamation, and so that became a tradition. And also a popular tradition was a farewell address, but George Washington didn't even address his farewell address physically. He sent out some newsletter. And this was hinted with George Washington's shoe size, but George Washington was a big man. He was 6'2", which really helped out with his wrestling career, as George Washington was inaugurated in the National Wrestling Hall of Fame. And there's a story that at age 47, he beat 7 people in a competition, similar to my boy Abraham Lincoln. Both George Washington and Lincoln were known as wrestling pros. So, yes. And also, speaking of Washington, Washington's name is much more blacker than Lincoln. A higher percentage of people have the name Washington in the black community than Lincoln. It's very surprising. I know in his deathbed, George Washington would never have thought that the ancestors of slaves would have his name. Yes, but George Washington probably thought that because he was afraid to die. He was afraid to being buried alive, which was common back then. So he told his people to wait until 3 days until they bury him. And his last words was "'tis well." And what was very well was George Washington being on the $1 bill, which he's the first president on the $1 bill. And his portrait on there is based on an unfinished work. Yes, a unfinished work. That's basically is what your dollar bill is. And a dollar in Washington's time was about $36. And Washington featured also on the first U.S. stamp. And when it comes to modern media, George Washington is the most portrayed U.S. president. Well, the second most portrayed U.S. president behind Abraham Lincoln. And Washington has his own street in Washington has his own street in Paris, which shouldn't be surprised because George Washington has 5,000 streets named after him. He is arguably the Americans with the most streets named after him. So that's my list, 100 facts about George Washington. Please subscribe and share the video. I am done.